Okay, we left off here looking at Akbar, who threw a guy out of a window twice to make sure that he was dead. And we learned that he actually was a good ruler, though that wouldn't make him a good ruler today. And now we move on to AURANGZEB, the next most famous, after the first two we already talked about, leaders or rulers of the Mughal Empire. And he happened to be around at a time when the empire was in decline, maybe partly because of his own policies, but partly, I think, through forces larger than him. But it was during Aurangzeb's reign where the empire reached its largest size, but that didn't necessarily mean it was healthy. He himself undertook a very determined and consistent campaign to push Mughal influence far into southern India, where it hadn't penetrated heretofore, and was only a bit successful at doing so. He was a stout, staunch Muslim who broke the policy of toleration that had been started by Akbar, who wasn't as much of a devout Muslim. And this guy, Aurangzeb, persecuted Hindus. He faced multiple rebellions against his rule and against his government, some of them due to his harsh religious policies. John Key, in his History of India, says accusations of bigotry are hard to counter about Aurangzeb and his administration. They focus on a whole range of measures introduced over a period of 20 years, which were indeed blatantly discriminatory. The tax on Hindu pilgrims, lifted by Akbar, was reimposed. Revenue endowments enjoyed by temples and Brahmins, leaders or upper class people, were rescinded. Hindu merchants were penalized by heavier duties. The provincial administrations were instructed to replace Hindu employees with Muslims, and most notoriously of all, newly built or rebuilt Hindu temples were to be destroyed, and many were destroyed. So, again, I think the empire was in decline anyway. He may have only kind of hastened its decline through his the policies here that are harsher than his predecessors. So now we move to that section of the unit chapter that talks about certain economic, social, intellectual, cultural features that sort of take the three dynasties, or take all we've been reading about, learning about, and kind of make generalizations about them to the extent that we can. So looking at the states that were created, the Ottoman state, the Mughal state, the Safavid state, they all had some similarities. Their authority in all three cases, for instance, stemmed from respect for the ruler's religious piety and military prowess, and their successors, the original ruler and their successors as well. So they had to be either religiously serious or at least have serious religious policy that could be respected, legitimizing them in the eyes of citizens or subjects, and they had to have military prowess to get the respect of subjects, to get their attention. There were problems in all these dynasties, especially with the Ottoman dynasty, which became famous for this. But steppe traditions, meaning traditions going back to the days when these were tribal peoples out on the Asian steppes, a lot of those customs stuck around, and some of them were problematic. For instance, there'd been a history of sharing power with family members, so that if the eldest brother was the leader of the tribe, the younger brothers would sort of be subordinates and carry out this function of government under their brother. That became increasingly untenable as family rivalries within dynasties, within royal houses, continued to plague them. And again, the Ottomans had this problem the worst, and their solution was the harshest, I guess not surprisingly, because it was a bigger problem there. So what do we see? Strangling victims with a silk bowstring. That became the tradition. That became what was expected of the Ottoman Sultan. When he came to power, a new one came to power, he rounded up his brothers and maybe even other, fairly close relatives, and had them strangled with a silk bowstring. The silk bowstring was a nice touch because that was supposed to be because they're royalty. They're from the royal family, so if you're going to strangle them to death, at least do it with a nice silk bow. That's true, by the way. So these could be brutal regimes and brutal within families. Another commonality between the three dynasties we've been looking at here was that even though Muslim theorists, scholars and clerics thought women should play no public role, in reality, at least wives and daughters of the ruler or the upper classes often wielded power or considerable power. So we're not talking about most women who lived, as peasant farmers in the countryside, but women from powerful families, particularly from royal families, often wielded considerable power. Our textbook does give a number of examples of that. The Islamic Empire's economies. Again, we're looking at similarities mostly here. All of them are agrarian empires, all the big dynasties and monarchies, kingdoms of the day that we've studied on all continents really were agrarian empires at this point, which means the base of their wealth was agriculture. So surplus agriculture here, or in these areas, was taxed to pay for war and administration. And surplus agriculture or farming is done on such a large scale that it allows for a lot of revenue to come in to pay for those things. So the governments are reliant on large-scale, huge farming to bring in the revenue to pay for government, which was mainly warfare, taxes, and administration in those days. Wheat and rice tended to be staple crops. The Columbian Exchange, which we've already talked about in an earlier unit, the connection of flora and fauna or trade back and forth between the old world, Europe, and new, the Americas, brought in time potatoes, tomatoes, corn, coffee, tobacco, etc. To Europe and to the Islamic kingdoms as well. The three territories under dynastic control here had long been wired into global markets for trade goods, so they didn't have to invent or sort of find new trade networks. They were already kind of tapped into them. All three of them, as our text tells us as well, saw population growth. The Ottoman Empire mainly through conquest, but the Mughal Empire through intensive domestic agriculture, meaning kind of natural increase. The Safavids saw less population growth, but they had at least some. There was, interestingly, in time, a vibrant coffee house, even tea house culture that sprung up in the Ottoman Empire. As Bentley says, the increasing popularity of coffee drinking and pipe smoking encouraged entrepreneurs to establish coffee houses where customers could indulge their appetites for caffeine and nicotine at the same time. The coffee house became a prominent social institution in the Islamic empires. So we think of, I think, the coffee houses as something intrinsic to the United States, Starbucks. But they were popular in Europe and popular in certain Muslim lands as well. It's also, I think, fair to say, that one of the reasons the coffee houses probably took off in Muslim territories is because drinking was forbidden. So you couldn't have like bars and pubs. There certainly was drinking still, but it had to be done, underground in private. So if you wanted to go and have to throw something back, it would have to be a latte or something, not a whiskey. The centrality of religion in the Islamic empires. All three of them had to deal with issues and questions of religious and ethnic diversity. They were all, as we've seen, quite diverse, particularly the Ottoman Empire, but all of them really were. They had a model that they pretty much all followed with variations of how to deal with the religious minorities in their midst. If we're saying they were religiously diverse, it means there's the religion of the ruler, which is usually the dominant religion. Even if it's not numerically dominant, it has the most power behind it. But what do you do with religious minorities? They didn't force them to convert to Islam, and they gave them personal freedom and rights to property and legal rights, etc. But in return, those people of different religions, like Christianity, had to pledge loyalty and paid a special tax. Sometimes they were actually treated as I think it's fair to say that they were treated in some places as second-class citizens and even abused or persecuted somewhat. But there are places in the world where minority groups, religious or otherwise, have been treated far worse. Many Muslims, however, were not happy with the official kind of tolerant religious policy, meaning Muslim authorities, the kingdoms, empires themselves, being tolerant of religions outside of Islam. And so religious conflict remained a part of life in these empires all the way through them. We talked about, for instance, in the Safavid Empire, the Sunni Shiite split and conflict, which preceded the Safavid Empire, and it outlasted it as well. So that conflict between those two groups within Islam its life was much longer than the Safavid Empire itself. Akbar, the emperor who threw two guys out the window, is a special case in terms of religious policy. And quoting our lovable author, Mr. Bentley, Akbar was cool even through his Islamic faith. In his effort to find a religious synthesis that would serve as a cultural foundation for unity in his diverse empire, he supported the efforts of early Sikhs who combined elements of Hinduism and Islam in a new syncretic faith. He also attempted to elaborate his own divine faith that emphasized loyalty to the emperor while borrowing eclectically from different religious traditions, though they drew most heavily on Islam. So Akbar was atypical in the sense that he wasn't a devout religionist or Muslim himself. He seemed to be inclined to quite shrewdly use religion to help cement law and order, and his concern for religion seems to be more political and social than actually religious. So that he wanted to dampen down religious tensions because he knew that such tensions could be a disruptive force politically in any government, any country. So there are other leaders around the world that kind of take this track as well. Elizabeth I in England, the great queen in Europe, she designed the Church of England basically to be kind of a syncretic compromise between competing groups within Christianity, and was religious, but not as religious as her older sister, Bloody Mary, who was a fervent Catholic, and it showed because Mary's policies were certainly one-sided, almost fanatical on the Catholic side, but Elizabeth's policies sort of compromised between Catholics and Protestants because she was a believer in God and Christ as Lord and Savior, a Christian, but not so fervent in her belief that she wasn't willing to compromise and be kind of prudent and practical. I see Akbar in somewhat the same light. I'm not comparing the two, Elizabeth and Akbar, in other ways, but in that sense, I think there's a similarity, and it's around the same time roughly too. Top-down culture in the Islamic states. Bentley tells us that the rulers were always concerned about the arts and learning, not necessarily out of interest, though a lot of them were interested, as we've seen, but for other reasons as well. As he writes, as the empires matured, the Islamic rulers sought to enhance their prestige through public works projects and patronage of scholars. They competed to attract outstanding religious scholars, poets, artists and architects to their courts. They lavish resources on mosques, palaces, government buildings, bridges, fountains, schools, hospitals, soup kitchens for the poor. On and on and on it went. As you can see from the two pictures here alone, there was quite a bit of majesty and creative brilliance that came out of their patronage, meaning they paid for these kind of architectural projects and others. On the left, we see a mosque in Istanbul, not just any mosque. This one was created in the name of, or in honor of, Suleiman the Magnificent, who we've already talked about. On the right, in Agra, India, Taj Mahal, maybe the most famous sort of landmark in India, at least to the Western world today. So these are just two of many, but two of the most renowned of these type of sort of awe-inspiring projects that were designed in part to show off the ruler's power, to show off his wealth, to sort of show off their kind of cultural sophistication, and to oftentimes bring sort of popularity to them. Sponsoring something like this, you can see the grandeur of these things, oftentimes did, I think, help with sort of getting what we call public opinion today on board with the leadership of the government. People tend to take pride in these kind of structures. Political decline finally sets in after the heyday of all three empires, Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, and in time you start getting more and more incompetent and decadent rulers. We've really seen the better of the rulers. We didn't really look at the bad ones, but some of them were terrible. And this happens around the world in long-term dynasties later, not always, but later in the dynasty, after you're a number of generations in. Sometimes the sultan, the king, the emperor, whatever his title is, starts to kind of take things for granted, takes his power for granted, and just becomes lazy, decadent, incompetent, and doesn't really rule the country or the empire, the kingdom, which of course can be a disaster. Ongoing familial dynastic rivalry, so conflict between brothers and uncles and cousins, sometimes deadly ones, helped stimulate this decline. Also, traditional Muslim clerics, holy men, disliked rulers' interest in unconventional forms of Islam, right, like Akbar's. That clearly was not going to be popular with the most serious Muslim clerics and scholars, and indeed it wasn't. But there were other leaders that did similar things. So even if the official policy coming from the top was one of toleration of other religions, that doesn't mean the majority of clerics or even the majority of the population actually liked it. Bentley concludes, in the Ottoman Empire, disaffected religious students often joined the Janissaries in revolt. A particularly serious threat came from the Wahhabi movement in Arabia, which denounced the Ottomans as dangerous religious innovators who were unfit to rule. The Janissaries, remember, the Janissaries in time became so valuable a military force that they kind of almost called the shots over the Sultan himself. And you can see it here, anytime they don't like something, a new rule, a new law, they rise up in rebellion, or many times they do anyway, and oftentimes get what they want. When political leaders can put the pressure effectively and get what they want time after time after time, you've got a political problem on your hands. Economic decline seeps into the picture here as well. These things are all, of course, intertwined and interrelated. But by the 18th century, all three of the empires were in economic decline and growing weaker by the year. There were trade deficits with Europe on the rise. meaning that Europe manufactured the goods and they paid for them, or they traded foodstuffs for manufactured goods. Whenever you have that kind of trade deficit, not just a trade deficit in terms of value, which was true too, but in terms of one side, doing manufacturing, other side providing resources and foodstuffs, the advantage is almost always, if not always, to that side that's doing the manufacturing and trading that for the foodstuffs and natural resources. After conquest slowed, right, as an empire, you can only go so far before you run out of steam or run up against opponents that who won't let you take their land, fend you off. Revenues start to drop because all three of these structures had relied on loot and pillaging, taxation being brought in whenever they added a new piece to the empire and brought more people under their control. But once the conquest is slow, then their tax base drops. So expenses then, relatively speaking, actually increase. On top of that, as the state, meaning the government, weakened, also governments lost control of certain provinces. Far off provinces sort of break away, and they didn't have the ability to stop it any longer. So this reduced taxable resources, again, further decreasing revenue. So if various provinces, out on the edge and frontier of your kingdom, your empire, can drop out and you can't do anything about it, well, there goes another part of your tax base. Officials in the empires tried to shore things up by raising taxes sometimes selling public offices, sometimes debasing the currency, sometimes just outright extortion. And none of these worked. The selling of public offices was fairly common in this era in other parts of the world as well. Europe, we've seen it there. That means that one of the ways to bring in revenue is to sell government jobs to people. Actually sell them a government job. And oftentimes the government jobs, once this stuff starts to get really out of control, there almost isn't a job for some people, but they still get the benefits and the paycheck and all that. So the idea is if people pay you the government a lump sum, because they need the money right now to pay for war or this, that, they'll agree to pay you a salary later on. So it's kind of like a loan where you get all the money up front at one time and then you pay it back, in sort of a trickle here and there. But that never works out. It's always a sign that your economy is going down the tubes. Debasing the currency is sort of inflating it. That never works either. It's a short-term solution, not a long-term one. So it can work in the short term, but it always creates long-term problems. But none of these things worked. Raising taxes, well, we know that raising taxes can always be a difficulty. Isn't always, but it can be. Bentley tells us this: as early as 1589, the Ottomans tried to pay the Janissaries in debased coinage and immediately provoked a mutiny. The next 150 years witnessed at least 6 additional military revolts. So again, we talked in the last slide about the power of the Janissaries, the over-reliance on them by the government of the Ottoman Empire, and so you didn't pay them, and they have a problem with it, and they let you know. This group by this time made up of soldiers and sometimes former soldiers and their family as time went on, they oftentimes carried a lot of weight. Military decline. If you've got political decline and economic decline in an empire, you likely have military decline as well. And sure enough, we do. By about the mid-17th century, as Bentley tells it, European military technology was advancing so rapidly that the Islamic empires could not keep pace. None of the empires had a large armaments industry, so they had to rely on foreign suppliers. their arsenals became increasingly dated since they depended on technologies that Europeans had already replaced. So Europeans were becoming the arms dealers, but they were actually selling them kind of the last phase of the technology. It's like giving somebody your old smartphone, and you have the latest one. So the Europeans were ahead for the Ottoman Empire and the others to acquire gunpowder weapons and other high-tech weapons of war. They had to buy them, and they were always buying kind of the older version of them, the previous edition of them, if not further back editions of them, and this caused certainly military problems and put these empires at a disadvantage. By the late 18th century, the author goes on to say the Ottoman Navy, which had long influenced maritime affairs in the Mediterranean, Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Arabian Sea, was closing its shipbuilding operations and ordering new military vessels from foreign shipyards. So they were building ships for a while, but once they see they can't keep up with the number and technology coming from Europe, they just give up entirely and start again buying their ships from those countries that are producing the sort of the highest tech ones. And there's a cultural conservatism that kind of hangs around this whole era in the Muslim world. Bentley, again, who I'm relying on heavily here in these last few slides, says that few Muslims traveled willingly to the infidel lands of the Europeans. Muslim rulers and their Muslim subjects were confident of their superiority and believed that they had nothing to learn from Europeans. As a result, most Muslims remained largely oblivious to European cultural and technological developments. Not until 1703 was there an attempt to introduce European scientific instruments such as the telescope into astronomical observatories. That's centuries behind what the Europeans were doing with the telescope. These conservative Muslim clerics soon forced the removal of the foreign implements, which they considered impious and unnecessary. So even then, the telescope was taken away and brought back only later on. The early example of the printing press in the Islamic Empire illustrates especially well the resistance of conservative religious leaders to cultural imports from Western Europe. And the printing press, I think, is the best example of this, but there are others as well. Not until 1729 did government authorities lift the ban on the printing of books, at least in Turkish and the Arabic languages, which were the kind of lingua franca of that time and place. So the unwillingness to engage in, try to keep up with modern technology was a major setback going forward. It wasn't necessarily clear at the time, but it didn't take long to make it clear that that put the Ottoman Empire and the other empires we're looking at in jeopardy. Resistance to printing reflected the concerns of conservative religious leaders that readily available printed books would introduce all manner of new and dangerous ideas to the public. Indeed, that an active publishing industry might spread inconvenient questions about the organization of Muslim societies or even about the Islamic faith itself. So if you want to, you think, well, why would they sort of reject the printing press as useful and you could say even necessary as it is? Well, there you have your main answer right there. The more conservative clerics and Muslims were more or less against the printing press because they were afraid that it might change society away from its traditional culture and particularly its religion. I'm not saying all Muslims thought that way, but enough did, and enough of power did, that that's basically the way these kingdoms went, which was to reject the printing press and other important technologies coming from not just Europe, but much of it from Europe, like the printing press. But this, haven't said this explicitly in some of our earlier units, though it's kind of been right there. But this is a good example, a slide, a piece of information that helps us to answer, at least in part, the question of why Europe. Part of the reason is the culture here in the Islamic world was so much dominated by religion, and to make it more disadvantageous for Muslims and Muslim peoples over the centuries. Too much of policy was in the hands of the most conservative religious leaders and groups, and they deliberately held the society back for fear of what the technology might do to their beliefs, to their values, to their own societies, and so this, and I mean, I'm not even criticizing it. Something to be said for tradition and holding fast to tradition. I respect the idea, but in terms of trying to keep up militarily, technologically, economically, this was not going to put them, Muslim peoples in Muslim kingdoms and countries, put them in a good place going forward vis-a-vis the Europeans primarily.